Welcome to Buddha in the Gas Pump, a weekly interview show in which we discuss spiritual awakening, for lack of a better term. This is the fifth in an ongoing series of interviews, and if this is the first one that you're catching, there will be titles at the end of this show to tell you how to watch the other ones. They're archived on YouTube, they're going to be archived on the Fairfield Public Access TV website, and there are various other alternatives. The reason we're able to make this a weekly show is that there are a great number of people these days who are undergoing a spiritual awakening. The terminology is a little bit ambiguous because different people might mean different things by those terms, but every week we discuss that term in particular and various other synonyms, and I think we're week by week arriving at a pretty good understanding of what is generally understood to be meant by a spiritual awakening. And so far, and I'm sure tonight will be no exception, our guests have been very clear and articulate and very genuine about what they're experiencing. This is not a philosophical or metaphysical discussion show in which we speculate about, things we might have read in books. This is a show in which we are discussing things that people are actually experiencing on a day-to-day basis. So, my name is Rick Archer, and I'm the host of this show. And my guests tonight are Fax and Sharon Gilbert, who are very dear and long-time friends of mine. And it's really a delight to have you two on the show.
Thank you for having us.
And so what I've generally been doing on these shows is just starting with a couple minutes of just kind of biographical information, who you are, what you do for a living, what are your hobbies, that kind of thing, just so we can get a feel for your kind of relative personalities or relative life. And then we'll begin to kind of get into what you may be experiencing or are experiencing. So whoever would like to go first.
I'm a performer. I'm in the schools. I do about 200 to 250 school programs a year, festivals. I'm an artist, and I use skills of mime and magic to communicate educational programs. I have one on character and bullying. I have one called Health and Happiness. I have a stage history play where I bring about 100 costumes, and then kids do a whole play in one day. So I travel a lot. I'm in and out of Fairfield all the time, usually home weekends and out during the week. And I've been doing this for 20 years.
Do you have a lot of that on video?
I do. I have some of it on video. I'm in the process of updating my website. So.
Yeah. You might want to put a lot of that on YouTube so people can watch it. In fact, I have a website associated with this show, and I link to the people that are on, if they have a website, link to the guests' websites. And people are often curious to see what people are doing. Like last week's guest is an artist, and she has her artwork on the website.
Well, I could supply you with several minutes of.
Yeah. And also, this station that we're taping this on could probably use some of your programming if you feel like having it shown. And what did you do before that?
Before that, I taught transcendental meditation for almost 20 years. I got into it right after college and became a teacher shortly thereafter. And Sharon and I taught, probably over 1,000 people all over the world.
Any hobbies or particular interests?
One of my passions is golf.
Oh, so you and Tiger Woods have a lot in common, huh?
It's kind of a loaded question these days.
No, they don't have that much in common. Except you play good golf.
Yeah, he has more mistresses than I do.
And more money.
Yeah.
How about you, Sharon?
Well, I'm kind of the support staff for Fax, and I spend a lot of time at home, actually, keeping the home fires burning, literally. And since he's gone quite a bit, I do a lot of the support work for that, and cut people's hair, and do some teaching, waking down teaching, and basically just trying to stay out of trouble.
Are you successful?
Pretty much.
Okay. Yeah. Now, having known you both personally for a long time, it's my understanding that you have each, in your own way, undergone a spiritual awakening, if you're comfortable with that particular terminology. And so perhaps you could each kind of tell the story of that awakening, and then we can kind of work both back and forward from that point to kind of see what might have led up to it or caused it to occur, and how things have been developing since then. So whichever of you would like to go first on that.
Do you want me to?
Sure.
Yeah, when you ask, is the term spiritual awakening comfortable for me? It is, and yet I wouldn't have described it that way myself. I was thinking about this, and thinking about this interview, what I would actually even call what happened. And I would call it kind of a coming into alignment with myself, or a falling into my actual sides, something like that, where there wasn't anything sticking out anymore, extraneous to who I am. And that happened for me very gradually over many years, and I didn't know it was happening until the process had completed itself in a certain way. I mean, when there was like a clicking in at some point, and then looking back on it retrospectively, I could see that it was something that was developing for many years.
Well, that's kind of a metaphorical description in a way, because you're talking about, just nothing sticking out, and you're kind of falling into you're fitting properly in yourself, and so on and so forth. And, it could easily be misconstrued what you're actually saying. So maybe you could kind of, as much as possible, elaborate on that, trying to kind of give the actual experience that you're trying to convey with those terms,
Okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I know it's always.
It sounds like a clothing store where you're just
and it's really true that, I mean, even if you just say simply it was a spiritual awakening, that can
what
be
does that mean?
misconstrued, So, let me see if I can be a little more clear and specific about that.
It sort of sounded like, you've just kind of arrived at a state of psychological health or personal comfort with who you are, or something like that, which may be an apt way of putting it, but I think there's more to it than that you'd like to convey.
Yeah, it was a time of coming into, I guess I'm coming back to the same words.
That's all right, I'll keep nailing you on that.
Okay. Coming into complete alignment with who I already am.
And who are you already?
I am, who you see before you.
Yeah.
And who I already am now is different in many ways than who I was at the moment of that recognition.
And probably different than who you were before the moment of that recognition.
And also the same as I've always been, and in some way. And that's why it was a coming into alignment. It was as though all that I had been striving for or seeking for the many number of years, even before learning transcendental meditation, that seeking just kind of fell back into a place of being who I am.
What had you been striving and seeking for? Wealth, fame?
Well, yeah, no, definitely not that. I mean, when I'd heard about the possibility of God realization, I knew immediately that was my purpose in life. And I didn't really, I didn't know what it was in the sense of being able to say, okay, this is the parameters of what God realization will be, until I would actually pin myself down about it. And then God realization, when I learned transcendental meditation and the whole understanding that was given around that, turned to enlightenment. So then I aspired to have enlightenment. And though I didn't really know what those were in a real sense, they represented to me the purpose of why I'm here on earth. And I knew that was, in some intuitive, deep way, I knew that was what I came here to be and to realize. So, but then of course, in the realization of it's quite different than the words that I would have used to describe it beforehand.
And so you meditated for decades, and then we'll get into some of the details, but then you did reach a point at which you, or maybe it wasn't a point, you say it was sort of a gradual transition, but perhaps a final acceptance of having kind of found what you were seeking.
Yes,
Mhm.
that's right. There was a moment of owning who I already am as
Mhm.
being what I've always been seeking.
And when that moment was reached, or even now, if it's easier to speak from
Mhm.
now, how was your experience different than what it had been throughout your life prior to that point?
There was, in the seeking of that, there's always a bit of anxiety involved.
Right.
And
There's always a carrot dangling that you're kind of
Yeah.
going after.
And that fell away.
Mhm.
And the essential, like, striving and confusion around my sense of identity
Mhm.
dropped away. There just wasn't a question about it.
Mm.
And there was what at the time, I remember I described that myself as a block of peace. I know that
A
sounds
block
odd.
of peace?
A block of, because I just felt like
P-E-A-C-E.
solid peace.
Right. Not frozen peace, but a block of
Solid.
peace, right?
Just solid. And that was my experience.
Uh-huh.
I would say
Unperturbable.
afterwards, for many months.
Right.
During the honeymoon period,
Mhm.
what I would call it. But, yeah, so that was, and it was, of course, a joy.
Yeah. So would you say that you are that peace? That
Yes.
that you're kind of,
Mhm.
you said, I'm a block of peace. I mean, ordinarily, if you say to somebody, okay, well, who are you? They
Yes.
say,
Yes.
my name is Sharon Gilbert. Well, no, I mean, in more detail, who are you really? Well, I live there, and I
Mhm.
have this job, and I have
Right.
these interests, and I like music, and I have 3
Mhm.
kids, if you had kids, or, whatever they can use to
Yeah.
describe the various features of their life. And,
Mhm.
and to most people, to my understanding, those things define who they are. And very
Right,
often when
right.
somebody loses a big chunk of those things,
Mm.
their whole self-image is shaken to the core, because that's who
Yes,
they are. I mean,
that's
if a
true,
wealthy
yeah.
person loses all his wealth, or
Mhm.
if someone loses a child that was
Right.
really the whole focus of their existence, or
Yes.
whatever.
Right.
So I think what you're saying is that you kind of discovered a deeper aspect of yourself that really can't be defined by those kinds of external cues or definitions. And well, peace is one word you used,
Mhm.
and usually we think of inner peace. So we can
Mhm.
think of
Mhm.
a peaceful external situation,
Mhm.
but you're referring to an inner
Mhm.
peace, which
That's
you
right,
might
yeah.
be just as peaceful running through an airport as it would be sitting in the woods or something.
Right, that inner peace, that is true, because, the outer world is almost never exactly at peace. I mean,
Mhm.
there are times when there's peaceful moments, peaceful periods in our life, but one can have inner peace, obviously,
Right.
in the midst of, what life continues to be.
Uh-huh. And so, if your realization was one in which your self-definition or your self-concept or your self-perception or your self-understanding shifted, and your identification became predominantly that with that peace,
Mhm.
then surely you also still had external characteristics, a body,
Yeah,
a family,
that's
interests,
right.
you're hungry, you're tired, you're sleepy, you're sick, you're healthy, all those kinds of things are happening to another aspect of your life.
Yes, and actually, I'm glad you put it that way, because even though my experience at that time was of being a solid block of peace,
Mm-hmm.
The peace came because the inner and outer experience had come into alignment with each other. There was a kind of a seamlessness of being.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though there is a whole external range of activity and motion and change, and my identity as a woman
Mm-hmm.
and a wife and whatever else I, you know, hold around myself as part of who I am externally, all that and the sense of my identity is not separate.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, I was going to say, do you consider that piece to be like a component of who you are? And in addition to that component, you have, you know, the various other components you just referred to. But you just said not separate, and not separate kind of implies
Right.
that it's not compartmentalized like
No,
that. Everything
no.
is sort of part of a larger wholeness, which,
Mhm.
you know, the piece is part of it, and all the other things you
Yeah.
mentioned are part of it at the
Yeah.
same time.
At the same time, right? It's, I mean, you can divide it into parts and
Mhm.
components for the sake of, you know, talking about it, or sometimes even doing inner work. You can, you know, I'm sure you've done this, where you can notice something in you or a part of you is experiencing something in the totality of who you are.
Mhm.
But that's really a conceptual separation, and it doesn't exist in reality.
So, but when the rubber meets the road, let's kind of consider the last time you got really upset about something.
Okay.
In the midst of that experience, John, this probably happened this afternoon, right?
Yeah.
In the midst of that experience, where was this peace and where was this awakening that you
Yeah.
underwent?
I guess I would, if we put it into a concept of like a spectrum of experience,
Mhm.
sometimes the piece is big and the, you know, whatever the frazzled moment might include
Mhm.
is smaller, and sometimes the frazzledness gets bigger and the piece becomes a little
Uh-huh.
less dominant in my experience.
So it's kind of like a lens, which can kind of zoom in here and zoom back there.
But yeah, a lot of it is in terms of where my attention is.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I can be completely involved in frustration of, you know, trying to get the cookies to come out right that I'm baking for
Mhm.
my family right now. And it's like, you know, there's so many little details that you have to be aware of, and I can't seem to get it exactly right each time. And at the same time, there is the capacity, I would say, in a moment to see myself and laugh at that, to laugh at myself going through that. But mostly I don't try to separate myself from my experience in any way. And if I'm going through, you know, external anxiety and even being totally upset, I don't try to adjust that necessarily, you know, unless I'm hurting the environment in some
Yeah.
way by my anger.
In other words, you don't try to use that sort of inner realization or inner peace as a tool to kind of dampen down
No,
the...
no, no.
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that
Mm.
because it isn't necessary.
Mhm.
For one thing, the piece has really no problem with the little fluff-ups in my personality.
And so you probably would consider it to be repressive and even unhealthy to try to sort of,
Well-
you know, to try to maintain some kind of external even keel.
Oh,
Uh,
yes, that's
you know,
true.
because
Yeah.
the internal keel is the thing that's really,
That's true.
you know, guiding the ship.
Yeah, that is true.
Huh.
I would consider it a bit intrusive or almost violent in some cases, especially to try to make everything fit into an attitude of, say, equanimity or something.
Mm.
On the other hand, though, I would say that in dealing with other people and being in harmony with my environment, I have more capacity now to take myself in hand
Be
and,
patient.
you know, and behave appropriately.
Mm.
I don't have to like fly into a rage just because I'm feeling one at any given time. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, because, I mean, there's a sort of a stereotypical attitude about what enlightenment might be that the Buddha himself kind of, you know, depicts with his
Right.
subtle smile and is so peaceful and all
Yes.
that stuff. But, you know, all the people I've known, including some famous saints who, you know, are, you know, regarded by millions to be enlightened, had a heck of a temper if the situation called for it, you know, and even sometimes
Yes.
where it didn't seem to call for it, as far as I could tell, but,
Yeah.
you know, they
Yeah.
they had no qualms about expressing the full range of human emotions.
That's right. Anyone who's ever lived in close proximity to even great realized beings, if you've been in an ashram, say, and you're one of the people who gets to be close to that person, there are many stories about all of them in terms of their temper. Very few of them were totally equanimous at all
Yeah,
times.
some of the old
If
Zen,
any.
some of the old Zen masters were said to be very fierce, you know, and strict and even harsh. And
Right. Even Ramana Maharshi, there's stories about him and his kitchen staff. You
Mhm.
know?
Oh, yeah.
They spilled any rice on the floor, you would
Huh.
get very
He didn't
angry
like
about
waste.
that.
It was
No.
very neat.
Huh.
Anyway, that's enough about me. So, do you want? To
Yeah, we'll come back to you, but
Okay.
let's hear Fax's story.
Yeah.
Well, I've been meditating for 25 years, and I was at the point where I'd pretty much given up any chance of awakening in this life, because when I'd sit to meditate, I had the same number of thoughts that I had, the year before.
Right.
It didn't seem like my stress level was getting any lower. If anything, it might be getting growing.
You didn't show any signs of
I
levitating.
showed no signs of levitation. I showed, if anything, I was going the opposite direction. And so I figured that, when I became a teacher, I was meditating for hours and hours every day for months. And if that didn't do it, I wasn't about to get back into that. So I pretty much resigned myself to just enjoying meditation for the rest of my life and whatever happened.
Yeah.
And in 1999, this is like 10 years ago, something started to get activated. Somebody said something, we were talking about unity, and this fellow said, I said something like unity is when everything is one. This fellow said, not even one. And so that, I heard that, and for some reason it just struck me as being very
Who's this fellow?
funny.
Andy Ryan.
Andy Ryan.
Oh, Andy Ryan.
Yeah, he was in town.
Mhm.
I was talking to him. And I started laughing.
Mhm.
There was something that it sort of like slipped past my conception of what a unity might be.
Mm.
Not even one. I mean, what is it if it's not even one? It made it more intimate to me.
Mm.
I had several other experiences over the next couple of months that kind of like activated my sense of presence or proximity to being. It wasn't so much a concept of far away.
Right.
And I was doing shows the whole time, but there was a liveliness there, as if something was moving that hadn't moved in a while. And Sharon set up an appointment with me with this fellow who was in town. He was a disciple of Papaji, an Indian master who had awakened a number of Western students who then came to this country. And so he had this process called Radical Awakening, and I went to that. And
Who was that?
His name was
Yukio.
Oh, the Japanese guy.
Japanese
Yes,
guy.
that's
Ramana
right,
or something.
Ramana.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Japanese
I remember him.
American.
Yeah.
And so I went to having no idea what it was. It was a type of self-inquiry which turned you back on yourself. I had a recognition. I wouldn't even call it an experience. It was just a recognition of, like when you meditate, you have the experience of, you have the identity of who you are, first of all. You're a person, you're a Red Sox fan, a golfer, and so on. There's whole layers of identity. And when you meditate, you have the experience of pure consciousness. Well, and then you come back and you are always having all these experiences. In this, it kind of flipped in that it was like as if consciousness became aware of itself, having the experience of Fax Gilbert. And it wasn't anything flashy, it wasn't anything special, it wasn't even hardly noteworthy, except that afterwards I just felt this peace. And I felt this connection. And I felt a separation between who I was as consciousness and who I was as Fax Gilbert. And I went home and I sat down to meditate, and there was nowhere to go. And so I went to sleep that night, nowhere to go. No mantras, nothing. And this just deepened over the next 6 months, a year. And
You kept meditating.
no, I didn't.
Oh.
I didn't use the mantra. I would sit
But
down.
you'd sit and close your eyes.
I'd sit and close
yeah.
my eyes. And there was no real way to describe it. I ended up reading these Advaitic books, Nisargadatta and Robert
Right.
Adams, and all these, to just try to connect what I had experienced with something that I could that I can hang on to.
I might just interject that Advaita means non-duality, and it's an Indian system of philosophy and experience that that aims to enable people to rise to a state at which they experience the oneness or the non-dual nature of life. Right? Is that a good definition of it?
Yeah, that's a good
Anyway, just have to, if
definition.
we're going to throw out a term like
Yeah.
that, we have to throw
No,
it.
that's true.
Of all the books, those are the ones that recognition I resonated with the most.
Nisargadatta, Robert Adams.
Yes, those
Mhm.
guys.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and it just kind of rolled up. From there, it was like, I look at people, and there was a connection. Who I was as conscious and who they were as consciousness. There was a connection.
You basically see that whenever you
see it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there was a disconnection between who I was as Fax Gilbert.
Mm-hmm.
There was a less of an attachment to the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat that
Mhm.
comes with daily living
Right.
and my relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And that went on for several years,
Mm-hmm.
where you just kind of more up here.
Yeah.
And then I had another, I would call it another awakening,
Mm-hmm.
where that recognition of who I was as consciousness went into my heart.
Very interesting. Yeah.
And that was through the instrumentality of working with people, Waking Down,
Right.
kind of system
Mhm.
of social interaction, speaking, gazing.
Mhm.
And it was very clear, it just went into my heart. And that range of identity that we were talking about, Sharon described it as seamless.
Mhm.
It was as if I was reconnected. This consciousness had finally owned itself as me.
Mm.
And there was a seamlessness about it. And that was at that point I just felt, I felt the fullness of being in my body for the first time, together,
Mm.
whole. And so that's kind of a Cliff Notes version.
Yeah. Has it gone beyond your heart?
I would say it's more in my body now, as
Mm.
well as the heart.
The reason I ask is that an American teacher who goes by the name of Adyashanti,
Wow.
who's coming to Fairfield in about a year and a half.
Okay.
That's as soon as he can come, because he's so popular.
Uh,
But in any case, he talks about a progression of awakening from the head to the heart to the gut.
Mm.
And maybe when you say it's in your body, that's what he means by gut.
mm.
But it's kind of cool
more-
that you
yeah.
notice the same progression, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah, it's more physicalized. It's to me, this evolution is not just going up and
Right.
up and away.
Yeah.
There's an evolution or incarnation of spirit into matter.
Mm-hmm.
And there are different progressions that individuals have in experiencing this. And people seem to awaken in their own way,
Yeah.
in different places and so on. But it seems like there's also, in addition to going up and recognizing yourself as consciousness, there's a movement inward to and allowing that consciousness to, so the rubber meets the road,
Mm-hmm.
live itself as you, more
Yeah.
and more fully. So you have like this dynamic set up between who you are as conscious and who you are as a human being, the limitless and the limits, and then the interaction of the two creates this, love, life,
Mm. Bliss, maybe?
bliss,
Yeah.
fear,
Huh.
the whole range.
Yeah. When you first started talking, you said that you had been at a stage in your life where you'd sort of thrown in the towel and you just kind of felt like, I've been meditating for 25 years, doesn't look like anything much is going to change, I'll just kind of
Exactly.
live it out like this. It's funny because this friend of mine, whom I've actually referred to a couple times in previous weeks' interviews, and who is on what is called the Purusha program in India, which is a monastic group of guys that are doing TM for maybe 8-12 hours a day, and TM and related practices up in the Himalayas, really going at it. He said that, he sent me this email a few weeks ago in which he said that a lot of the guys that he hangs out with, and he feels maybe a lot of people out here have, kind of reached our age, and they've kind of begun to reach a sort of a spiritual midlife crisis in which they feel like, well, maybe I'm not going to make it, and what do I do now? And what are the implications of this? Am I going to sit here for the rest of my life, or what? And his accusation of my show was that I've found a lot of people who have compromised and who have lowered the bar just to make themselves feel better, because they sort of feel like, oh, well, otherwise my life is in vain, everything I've been doing all these decades, and so I'm just going to kind of cheapen the definition of enlightenment in order to claim it and make myself feel good. And his main sticking point was that, in the TM movement, has been a teaching that being able to perform siddhis, or sort of so-called supernormal abilities, is a litmus test of having actually attained enlightenment. And that in the TM movement, there's a sort of a hierarchy of states of consciousness: cosmic consciousness, God consciousness, unity consciousness. And according to his understanding, even cosmic consciousness should be associated with the ability to perform siddhis. My own attitude, and I'll let you respond to this, is that I take everything with a grain of salt. I mean, no matter who says it. And I certainly respect and quote and read all kinds of so-called spiritual authorities, and I take what they have to say into consideration. But I've kind of reached a stage in my own life where I'm not comfortable taking anything as a dogma or anything as an ironclad rule, because there seem to be exceptions to every generality, and awakening seems to show up in about 7 billion different flavors, So anyway, could you perhaps respond and elaborate on what I've been saying there? Either of you, really.
Well, interesting idea, interesting question. And I know that is a concern that, people who have been very dedicated, as we all have been, for many years on the trajectory of self-recognition, God consciousness, and so on, they don't want to fool themselves. And that was certainly primary in my experience too. I did not want to, I didn't want to accept anything less than the real thing, and I definitely did not want to be fooling myself. And in fact, for me, doubting was my ally in this process, and that I would hold off for many years, even trusting my experience, because I didn't want to believe anything that wasn't true. And so when the realization fell in, there was a habit of doubting even, and so there was a questioning that would come occasionally for about a week or two, a deep questioning of this, this can't be it, is this it, and really questioning, and then recognizing that I could let go of the doubt of my mind and just fall into what I was actually being in that moment. And that, for me, eased the pain and struggle of doubting. But yet, it took a while for me to let go of that because of that very reason, not wanting to fool myself. And I can certainly understand where that person is coming from in saying that. And I think it doesn't hurt to doubt, to a point, and then after a point, you can question the doubt.
Right. It can be a game your mind, a habit your mind has fallen into, just
That's right.
cranking along with the same old,
And actually, a lot of the people that I talk to who are still aspiring for the self-recognition, I see in them that there's a way in which they're denying their experience because they are, so avidly concerned that they not be fooling themselves.
When I mention this show to people around town, there's generally a very positive, enthusiastic response. It's just, oh great, it's about time, something from there. But some people have the reaction, and maybe I actually am not talking to a representative sample of the community. I have my own little circle of people who think like I do, but some people have the reaction that, they refer to it, that you're interviewing people who think they're enlightened. And there's a sort of a sarcastic undertone to the use of that phrase. And almost a hostility sometimes. And Fairfield does have a history of people who caused a bit of trouble, and actually were perhaps, argued to be crazy, and who proclaimed enlightenment.
And so I can understand why why people might be a little bit squeamish or skittish about anyone who claims to be enlightened, but it's becoming so so commonplace almost. There's so many
Yeah.
people that are having awakenings,
Right.
and part of the
And
reason I
I
wanted to
think
do this
that's,
show was to make it obvious to
Yeah.
the community that this is actually something happening here.
Right, right. And I think that's one of the reasons we refer to the events of our recognition as recognition, awakening, realization, rather than enlightenment, because there's so much,
Baggage.
well, yeah, it's like talking about God. I mean,
Yeah.
the conceptual understandings that we've gained over the years may not really be in line with your recognition.
Yeah.
And your recognition, maybe you're not one of the great realizers with all of the cities and the halo around your head, but you can be self-realized as you are, and the concepts of enlightenment that we carry sometimes are actually getting in the way of letting ourselves be the awakened one that we are.
Yeah.
So,
And which is not to say that somewhere down the line you might be the character with the halo and
Possible, I
the
suppose,
supernormal powers, but who knows what the whole span of
yes, right.
human development or spiritual development is.
And growth doesn't stop with what Maharishi calls unity consciousness. There are possibilities of unfoldment and deepening that continue constantly.
From what I can gather, growth does not only not stop with the dawn of awakening, but it accelerates. I mean, that's
I would
what
say
I keep
that's
hearing
true.
from
Absolutely,
people.
that's so true.
Yeah, it's sort of like because you kind of gotten out of the way of your own progress at that point. Maybe that's one way of putting it.
And another way of looking at it too is that, if there's a solid basis of ground under your feet, so the ground of being, you can reach farther and you can dare more.
You can also relax more, I think. I think a lot of us tend, maybe it's the way humans operate, we tend to kind of suppress or bottle up things that are too uncomfortable to look at
Yeah,
or
that's
to
right.
experience. But if you have, how did you put it?
Ground, solid ground of
ground of
being,
being,
yeah.
then you can relax, and if these things come up, they're not so overwhelming as they might
Yes,
otherwise be.
that's really true.
And they can dissolve. When I was a new meditator, I went to my TM teacher, and I was really upset because my girlfriend at the time was getting into heroin, or getting back into heroin or something like that, and I didn't know what to do. And my teacher said, and I've always liked that phrase because, I mean, if you think of it, if we have all this stuff, all this mud in us that from traumatic experiences and whatnot we've experienced in life, if we're a glass of water, try to dissolve some mud in a glass of water, it's not too successful. It's a muddy glass of water, but if you're an ocean, throw the mud in, dissolve. So, with this ground of being referred to, perhaps a lot of stuff can get dissolved more quickly and more clearly.
Yeah.
I wouldn't use the word dissolve so much as what happens is that it kind of when you kind of accept your humanity and your consciousness kind of like connects with who you are as a person, then a lot of the things that were kind of submerged kind of zoom forth. There's it's as if well, for example, in our marriage, we married for we'll be 35 years this year. And in order to make things comfortable over the years, certain things would come up which weren't really gone, we didn't really go into them, dealt with.
Right.
But after awakening, these same things would come up, and there was more of a foundation for going into it and bringing it into the light of consciousness, so to speak. And there was a greater foundation because I remember I would get angry about something that Sharon did, and that she wasn't able to hold it because she had abusive parents and so on. They would always get angry at her, and it was very traumatic.
Yeah.
And after awakening, I found that she would come right back at me, and so it was such a relief to be able to just let it out and have it come back, and then have it
To deal
just
with stuff that
right,
was uncomfortable.
It was uncomfortable,
Yeah.
right? But what it did was it creates more of a connection, a passion, a
Yeah.
presence that hadn't been there. Everything was kind of mechanical, and it became alive.
It's interesting, you know, there may be a lesson in that for me. I mean, sometimes if my wife gets mad, I'm tempted to
Yeah.
reciprocate,
Mhm.
but I find that if I can just sort of hold my temper and be patient, 5 minutes later she's completely different mood, the whole thing has
Mhm.
passed. And I
Mm.
feel like if I had reciprocated,
Mm.
it would have, you know, exacerbated the situation, and
Mm.
we you know, we'd still be feeling bad. So,
Mm.
but I don't know, you know, maybe I'm.
It's
maybe
just,
I'm
it's just,
repressing.
every situation's different, every
Yeah.
couple's different, but, and sure, in certain situations, that's the right thing to do, but in other situations, maybe stuffing yourself over and over
Mm.
isn't necessarily, you know, the right thing to do. Maybe
Yeah.
just blowing it off. It's just, behavior becomes more spontaneous. It just,
Yeah.
there's no way of,
You
it
know
just
what-
happens, you know,
Mhm.
so.
You know, and the point you were making too about being the ocean and the
Mhm.
mud dissolving it, it does seem as though there is an integration of aspects of myself which before have been uncomfortable to experience. For instance, you know, you wake up at 3 in the morning and there's anxiety that in the past perhaps I would have done everything I could to avoid feeling that and you know, tried to practice sleep, maybe get up, read a book, anything to avoid feeling the anxiety.
Yeah.
Whereas now there's a willingness to, and a curiosity even, to feel what's there, what's arising in me. Because I found that really there's nothing which can overpower or overthrow my being.
Mm.
Uh,
That's interesting.
you know, so there's more, and then what that fear or anxiety or whatever impulse like that might arise gets, the energy behind it, I could say, maybe gets integrated,
Integrated.
not dissipated. In a way, maybe you could say dissipated in that it becomes part of the wholeness. You know.
Mm.
Maybe there was something which I've been holding out or which I haven't really been conscious of, which then becomes conscious and part of the totality of my being.
That's interesting. I know the character of my own meditation has changed in recent times from kind of an underlying attitude of kind of seeking the bliss to kind of an approach in which I you know, consciously and willingly allow my awareness to go to discomfort, fear,
Yeah.
vulnerability, anxiety, and a lot of times I'll sit there for an hour and just sort of feel these kind of
Yeah.
waves of fear and maybe depression or anxiety. But it feels like something very healing is taking place.
Yeah.
And it's a little different than the way I used to go about it.
Well, and healing is wholeness. too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that you want to banish some demon,
Right.
more that being able to open your awareness within that impulse that's coming up. Because there is awareness there possible too, and then it becomes part of the personality.
Yeah, that's it. Who is
Yeah.
Mahatma Gandhi or Nelson Mandela or somebody that says make the enemy your friend, and that's what he
Yeah.
beat the enemy.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's good.
So,
I just wanted
go
to say,
ahead, please.
you know, the whole idea of enlightenment versus awakening. The word itself, it seems like it's like a noun. It has like an ending to it.
which one?
Enlightenment.
Right.
Whereas I don't feel, you know, from the recognitions that I've had, is like the recognition of who you are as consciousness is a solid, non-changing identity. But the rest of it, the recognition of who you are as consciousness living itself as you, is constantly changing, constantly growing. So it's like a paradox. You become comfortable with paradox.
Beautiful. I love that. Very good.
Because, and the idea that, you know, you think you're enlightened, it has nothing to do with thinking. I mean, you don't have to think that you're a male, or that you're an American, or that you're a Red Sox fan. It's part of your identity. It's not a
Yeah.
thought. It's not a concept that you own or that you figure out. It's a surprise, is what it is. It's a surprise. That's what an awakening is. You're surprised by something. You're surprised by yourself.
I think it's possible for a person to think erroneously that they're,
Or to believe they are.
delude themselves. Yeah.
Because
Right.
you don't walk around thinking I'm enlightened, I'm enlightened.
Right.
I'm
I mean, it's possible.
Yeah.
You know, I think we've all seen examples of it, but
But this is not to say that whatever spiritual prowesses and development that people are having, you know, in Perusia and in caves around the world,
Right.
or anything like what we're doing. I mean, it could be something totally different. It could be a totally different, you know, identification, a totally different experience.
It could be culture.
A totally different dharma.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
different dharma. And by dharma we
Yeah.
mean sort of course of action which is most appropriate for that
For that
individual.
person, that individual.
Right.
Yeah.
Although I do think, wouldn't you agree that, you know, although externally people are doing very different things in the course of developing spiritual.
Self is the self.
Yeah, there's some kind of commonality
Yeah.
at the basis of it all.
Yep.
Um,
And then how it reintegrates into that personal journey is
Right.
different. Yeah.
Light that is one little lamp to many.
Yeah.
That's an incredible
Yeah.
statement to put it.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
They should know.
Yeah, I guess so. So,
I love this conversation though about thinking one is enlightened, because I don't think about it as enlightened. I don't think about myself as enlightened even.
Right.
And one of the great joys of my realized existence since the time when I finally owned who I am as who I am,
right.
is the joy of just being an ordinary real life person, and also just being in ordinary life and having the joys and the sorrows also that come with that are, to me, that, and not knowing, the element of not knowing rather than the totality of knowing everything. You know, we've all heard that idea that when you're enlightened you know everything. And for me it was the freedom of not knowing that was blissful to me. So it can be blissful either way.
I personally, in my terminology, I tend to reserve the term enlightenment for some sort of ultimate state of development, if such even exists. You know, and maybe you could count people who attain that on the fingers of one hand, probably people at any given time in the world who attain it. And it's my perspective that there are many stages of awakening. There may be an initial one that's very significant, which is irreversible, and from that point on you're kind of grounded in yourself. But as we've been saying, it doesn't stop there. And you can stop if you wanted to, I think. And there's who knows how many stages or
Right.
degrees of
That's
development.
right.
And it's, you know,
And I think somehow it seems to be part of realizations or awakenings, that often it feels like this is it. You know, it's almost like,
couldn't get any better than this.
right. And like
Like
when
the
you
guy's
had the
fishing.
realization you did with Brahmana, where that self-recognition itself, recognizing yourself as consciousness,
Mm.
you couldn't conceive for a couple of years at least of there being anything more to realize.
No,
And then
Like
at
the
some
guys
point
in that
there
beer
was.
commercial sitting in the boat fishing,
Yeah.
and it doesn't get any better than this.
Yeah, exactly.
God, it keeps
Yeah,
getting better.
it keeps-
Keeps getting more true.
More
I wouldn't
true.
say, see, better indicates, okay, I'm happier and happier, and
Yeah.
but I would say truer. There's a, it's like truth begins to zoom forth in different levels, and that becomes more your focus in life is those moments of truth, whether they're painful or not.
Is that
or
the kind
whether-
of thing you could give examples of?
Yeah.
Or just-
About a month ago, my mother passed away.
Mhm.
It was fairly quick, fairly sudden, and we went out to Boston to be with her, and we were there just the day before she passed. And what happens, in my experience, is that like her life zoomed forth in both aspects, both the purity of it and the goodness of it and the givingness of her life, and at the same time there were the limitations that she was as a person. And it was as if the aspects of my being, the wholeness of my own being was activated, and at the same time the excruciating limitations of her passing were also enlivened. And so there was this poignancy of being that was very lively and very full. It was as if both aspects of my identity, the identity of who I was as a person and the limitations that came with that was there fuller, and the fullness of that which held it, the consciousness that registered those experiences was there more fully. And so to me, that's like the stuff of life, you know, it's because it's real. There's no like conceptual about it. You're there, and it's right there with you, and who you are zooms forth to meet it in whatever capacity you have.
It's interesting because Maharishi used to use the phrase 200% of life. I think most of us kind of thought of that as being, all right, on the inside I'm going to be the straight and right and wise yogi. On the outside I'm going to be filthy rich, you know. And
right.
you know, and what you're saying is kind of a beautiful example of perhaps well, there could be many examples, but I think it's a nice example.
There's a
of what
place.
might have
There's a
meant.
there's a place for the thorns. In terms of thorns, I mean like limitation, perhaps, because what it does is it caps the boundlessness of your consciousness, and
Caps it?
it
Yes.
well, it's as if there's a limit. And looking at a sunset,
Right.
it's fragile. It's gone, and yet because it's fragile and because it is gone, it makes it beautiful. It creates that charge. If the sun's there all the time,
Right.
then there's
Yeah,
not that
makes
connection.
sense.
And so the limitations create this polarity where the being flows to limitation. Limitation is like a marriage,
Yeah.
and the poignancy of life becomes precious.
So in other words, it's almost like you're saying, and maybe you'll tell me if I'm wrong, that the limitations make you appreciate the unlimited aspect more, and the unlimited aspect makes you appreciate the limitations more. They kind of mutually enrich one another. Is that correct? No. Yeah.
I would say, yeah. Yeah, it's see what it does is it's like who we are both limitation and unbounded. And it's sort of like it's sort of like a slot machine. When stuff like that happens, it's like more of who you are comes forward into the moment. There are times when you're more caught up in the limitation, the day-to-day getting through whatever, and then there are times when there's more of that fullness of who you are as being.
Yeah.
But when something like that pulls all of it forward, then there's this kind of a sweet sadness of both together, which becomes precious.
I gave an example last week, which I think might illustrate this. Is, you know, an example of running through O'Hare trying to catch a connecting flight, and noticing that you know, in the midst of all this chaos, near close to Christmas, crowded airport, late for the connection, you know, and lungs burning, running down. There was this deep silence, you know, which was just as predominant, if not more so, than all the chaos of the airport. And instead of thinking, oh, this sucks, I'm going to miss my flight, what a drag, it was like, wow, this is fun. This silence is cool. Oh, this activity is cool. It's beautiful. Loving the experience, you know.
So even while you were experiencing like the burn of the lungs and
Yeah.
the concern about getting your flight,
Which I missed.
there was all you did. Oh my
Well, I
God.
got another one.
But that at the same time there was an enjoyment of the whole experience.
Yeah, it was like a blast. I was really having fun. And it's just a case in point. And, you know, but
So there was a certain amount of freedom there at the time that you felt like gotta get to the plane.
yeah. I mean, I was doing my darndest to get to the plane
Yeah.
because I didn't want to miss the connection. But at the same time, it was
Right.
there was this feeling like it's not going to be the end of the world if I
End of the
don't
world,
get it.
yeah.
Something, the next
Right.
thing will happen, whatever that is.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. I like your use of the word paradox. Do you find that your ability to incorporate the paradoxes within, you know, existence itself, with the universal value, the individual value, also makes you more broad-minded in incorporating other paradoxes, such as political perspectives, religious perspectives, different things like that people get so combative about in this world.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Stored at that one sometimes.
Yeah. No.
Because you have your own particular political philosophy
Yeah,
as an individual.
Yeah. I mean,
Well, you know, I'm serious when I had to work at that one because it's painful to be only on one side, you know, of something. And yet you do find that you are on one side of something, at least in terms of your opinions, your sensibilities, and so on. So it's useful to open to recognize that there's room in life for opposites, that even having enemies is useful because it strengthens when you have an enemy. So, having all the voices is a good thing, but it's still painful and I'm saying painful to the personality to have somebody express a point of view different than my own, and sometimes I get very angry at those people. So I think both are present, both tendencies.
What I usually find is I kind of feel like I can see why they think that way, gun control, abortion, healthcare debate. I can see why they have the attitude they have, but I don't agree. Here's my attitude,
Yeah.
and variety is the spice of life, and it takes
Yeah.
if we all thought the same way, it wouldn't be a very interesting world. But you have your kind of point on the spectrum as well in terms of your own opinion.
Exactly,
Which
yeah.
I think leads to a broader point, which is that some people feel or that enlightenment or spiritual awakening or whatever term we want to use kind of turns you into a blob, a personality-less,
A colorless sap.
colorless sap. Yeah, somebody who really doesn't have any conviction.
Well, here's
Yeah.
the thing.
Yeah.
You recognize yourself as consciousness, and that's a part of your identity, and you can feed that, which can take you out of the colors
Right.
that are the rest of your identity.
sort of
You can definitely feed that through experience, through direction, through attention, so that becomes more of who you are, and that's your bigger reality, so to speak. Or you can go into the other aspects of your identity, the human aspect, the limitations, the personality, the story,
Right.
whatever it is that's there that makes your person who it is can also be enlivened. And so it just depends where the attention goes in terms of what gets enlivened. I don't think there's any okay, you'll be like this or you'll be like this.
Do you think that's a Dharma issue again?
Yeah, I do.
Some people just have a natural inclination to be aloof and not so involved in things.
It could also be a lack of understanding. Somebody has an awakening, and for the first few years of mine, that was all it was. And everything I did was to culture that consciousness. My identification as consciousness. That was where my attention was, and that was dominant
Right.
in my identity. So it's just, I think, just a natural kind of progression that takes place.
Some spiritual texts and teachers say that you want to kind of save the reason for having a more reclusive or less involved life is to spare yourself the impact of sensory impressions, of sensory overload, because that kind of overshadows being or pure consciousness. When you took the opposite tack after those first several years and began to plunge into your relative life more, did you find that anything was lost or overshadowed?
I would say that the other aspects of my identity began to balance out, what was there in terms of consciousness. There was both of that.
You mean more of a balance between your relative interests?
I think the idea that awakening is just in one direction is it's an individual thing. It's not something that is intrinsic to the awakening itself. You see, the awakening itself isn't on the level of mind or feeling. It's consciousness awakes to itself. So it's who you are.
Right.
What's going to stop it? It's going to be it's beyond death.
Right.
And so it's going to be beyond a feeling if it's beyond death. It's going to be beyond a thought about it. It's more intimate to you than who you are as a person, which is a thought.
I have a friend who had an awakening, and she said, I think I'm going to see if I can make this go away. So she proceeded to get rip-roaring drunk, to see if it would. And it didn't, although I don't think that's something she made a daily habit of. But,
It can't go away.
yeah.
Before the awakening is the self. After the awakening is the self. there's a dot. You put a dot right here, and that's not awakened. And then you put another dot right there, and that's awakened. Okay, what's the difference? One knows it's awakened, the other one doesn't.
Yeah.
It's the same situation.
Well, that may, from some perspective, that might not make any difference, but from the perspective of the person actually living life, it could make a heck of a lot of difference in terms of the degree to which they enjoy their life or the quality of their life and so on.
Yeah, if you have being strong seekers before this all came about, there was the idea that there were actions that we could do which would further the process of enlightenment.
Like rub oil on your body. Or
Whatever,
whatever.
all of the myriad things that we believed
Uh-huh.
would speed the process, and I don't know if they did or not. I know that we did them sincerely and diligently, and then awakening happened.
Yeah.
So there, I don't know if there's a cause and effect with that, and,
I would tend to, my own attitude is that there is a cause and effect. I mean, spiritual practices have a purpose, and people who practice them tend to awaken more commonly than those
Oh,
who
sure.
don't.
Mhm.
And I think it's not just coincidental,
I
it's
think that is
causal.
true, yeah.
And what it really does is it does sort of, purify, clarify, make the nervous system more, a more fit instrument for having that realization. Because any realization, anything experience is experienced through the instrumentality of a nervous system, a brain.
yeah, that is right. That's true.
I mean, in fact, if an awakened person had a stroke and the brain was severely damaged, I wonder what would happen to their awakening. I don't know.
Well, Ram Dass had that.
That's true, he did,
So
yeah.
he has a whole book about it.
Yeah, yeah. Pure Grace.
Yeah.
I saw the
Yeah.
documentary. So, I have some questions here, and I'm in no hurry to ask them because this is going well. And if I'm not asking something that, some thought pops into your mind, or you feel like there's some thread of the conversation that could have taken us in an interesting direction, feel free to bring it up. This is very informal. Is there anything hanging loose? One thing that occurred to me a minute ago is when we were talking about, kind of plunging into life and really, and I forget the terminology, but allowing consciousness to kind of be lived in your relative life. Seems to me that that's kind of
Well, the recognition is that it is now and always has been living itself as who you are,
right.
and that there's a joy in that.
Yeah.
And liberation, because there's nothing to do. There never has been anything to do to be that, because that's always the situation. Always, you never get in your own way, because that which is realized has always been hidden anyway.
Yeah. Although, I think that kind of talk is a little bit dangerous because, I mean, I've run into people here and there who just adopt that as an attitude. There's nothing to do, I'm fine as I am, I'll just go ahead and live
You're
my
right.
life.
That's
And
absolutely
they haven't
true,
had
yeah.
any sort of awakening or realization, but
Mhm.
they're just kind of copping
Yeah,
out.
it doesn't work as an
Yeah.
attitude.
It's not an attitude.
The right attitude, if you're gonna have one, is, I must have this, I
Yeah.
must know God, myself, or whatever.
Mhm.
Your hair should be on fire to
Yeah.
have it.
Yeah.
That would be a better attitude.
Right, the old
But at some
story
point.
of the master holding the disciple under water
Yeah.
till he almost drowned, and
Right.
then letting him up and say, you have to want it as bad as you want to breathe,
Yeah, I mean, if you have to have an attitude, the one that comes most naturally before awakening is that strong desire.
Yeah.
I think that is true what you're saying.
I
Yeah.
think there's an element of grace to the whole thing, where just you can make yourself available to awakening. You can have spiritual practices. One Zen master said that the spiritual practices is that awakening is not a linear thing, and that awakening is an accident. But the spiritual practices kind of make you accident prone.
Good one.
So
Yeah, I mean, there have been instances in which people have been alcoholics or drug addicts or whatever, and have come upon some spiritual awakening. I mean, Byron Katie was in a halfway house.
Yeah.
Cockroach
Kind of
crawled across her
unconscious even,
foot.
a
Yeah.
little bit,
Yeah, she was
stupor,
pretty out of it,
yeah.
and a cockroach crawled across her foot, and somehow or other that triggered an awakening.
A powerful awakening.
Yeah, she was never the same thing.
It's like in a sense, to me, it was like a reset button in that the recognition of who you are as consciousness, and going back, was always there, registering every experience that my memory would have. In order to have that experience, it was being registered by consciousness, and it was like kind of a reset, so that in a sense, nothing happened. There was no change. There was no experience. It was just a recognition of a reality that has always been there. And so, in that sense, that's what I said. Nothing happens. But that's something happened, but it wasn't an experience. It wasn't like something in time and
The
space.
recognition happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of like you've always been a multimillionaire, but you forgot you had the bank account. And one day somehow or other you get the key and you open it up and you oh my God, this has been here all these years. I've been scraping and saving and pinching pennies, and I've always been a millionaire. I'll be done.
Oh, you're looking for your glasses, and
Yeah, they're on your head.
that
But
kind
at
of
the
thing.
time we're saying this, I remember how frustrating it was to hear people talk
Something like
this.
that. Yeah, sure.
Because you're just like trying to get it, trying to understand it, intellectually cognize it, make it happen somehow, and smugly sitting here and saying this can be very frustrating to hear
Yeah.
for a true aspect. And so I guess I would just have to say, when I was saying that there's nothing you can do to get this, even that is extremely frustrating, because you want to be doing something. So it is good to have a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
At least it helps you to relax,
Yeah, I mean, if we had to distill this down to a practical recommendation, mine would be keep doing your spiritual practices. Do whatever you think is helping you, and
I
whatever
agree.
you enjoy, and whatever seems to be producing benefits. And
Yeah, and just keep your mind open and listen.
I would say also, if you know somebody who's had an awakening, talk to them about it, and
Spend time
and
with
spend
them.
time with
It
them.
is contagious.
It is contagious.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and don't be afraid to speak about where you are in your process, and that way, if there are misconceptions to owning a recognition you may have already had, they can be cleared up.
Yeah, that's important. I mean, and there are all kinds of groups and gatherings that a person can associate with in order to interact with people who've had spiritual awakenings. And you guys have been in the Waking Down group for some time, which I think if you do a search on Google for Waking Down, will come right up near the top. And there's, of course, the PM movement. And here at Fairfield, we have a weekly discussion group every Wednesday night, in which probably half the people in the room are awakened, and it's been very instrumental in helping others awaken. And that's actually a traditional thing too. Many of the ancient traditional scriptures say that the company of the enlightened or the company of other awakened people is an extremely powerful advantage for awakening oneself.
Absolutely. And part of the reason that that's true is because, for me anyway, being with people from my own culture in particular, or other women, or people that have had similar histories to me, and they're obviously living a state of deep self-acceptance and peace and joy.
Right.
And seeing that they're just like me, or I'm just like them in most ways, and realizing I don't have to perfect myself in order to be all of who I am. I don't have to purify myself or be some other person, or have other kinds of experiences that are more exalted than the ones I'm having. And if there were something that I could tell my previous self, that's one of your questions. That if there's something I could tell myself, it would just be trust yourself, trust your experience.
Yeah. I mean, we talk of lowering the bar. I think many people raise the bar to an impossibly great height.
Yeah.
And they also, I think there's also a tendency in this community at least, which has a background, a spiritual background by and large, that stems from an Indian tradition. There's a tendency to associate, or perhaps to confuse, many of the trappings of Indian culture with awakening or enlightenment itself. And anybody can come into town here wearing a dhoti and using an accent, and people will fall at their feet. It's enlightenment or awakening is not Indian.
No.
You know, it's not Asian. It's not even earthly. It's a totally universal thing, which I imagine is pretty much the same thing on Alpha Centauri as it is here.
Perhaps, yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Huh. It's my understanding, I don't know too much about Waking Down aside from, talking to friends who are involved in it, and it's my understanding that there's a sort of an interesting checklist that you actually can sit down and go through with someone who, to verify whether an awakening that they feel they've had is legitimate or not. Can you talk about that, or is that sort of proprietary
Well,
information or something?
It's not exactly a checklist. We were at a teachers' conference, we're teachers in Waking Down, and we were at a teachers' conference this summer where the teachers who have the job of sitting with someone and hearing what their experience is and then confirming for them what they already know. They talked about it at length, and it isn't really a checklist. And they all had their own way of appreciating what someone is saying.
Oh, so
where
it's not
they're
some
coming from.
standardized
No.
questionnaire or something?
No, not at all.
Okay.
In fact, a lot of it had to do with confidence in healing. Confidence when a person speaks their own experience in their
Right.
own words. When I say their experience, I'm not speaking of experience like celestial experiences, but I'm talking about the way one has in relating to life and to their own identity. In speaking that, there's a confidence in being which comes forward, and
And a uniqueness of
integration,
expression.
and a uniqueness of
Like
expression.
they're not just parroting.
Right, exactly.
Right.
A
Yes.
uniqueness of expression where it's possible to determine that a person really owns, this identity.
Do you feel that you both can pretty reliably assess?
No.
No.
We're
Get a feeling for
we're
it.
kind of new teachers, and we each have several people that we work with,
Right.
and some on the phone, some in person,
Mm-hmm.
and we create the space where they can begin to own more of who they are in terms of who they are as an individual and who they are as consciousness,
Yeah.
and it's just in a conversational way.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend at Cafe Paradiso, which is a local coffee shop here, and she was saying, "How are you going to choose people for the show?" And I said, "Well, I kind of have to take them at their word. I mean, I'm not really qualified to, determine whether someone's awake or not. I just kind of maybe have a feeling about them. There might be somebody that I'm rather skeptical of, but I certainly can't tell anything for certain." And she said, "Sure you can. You can tell them." I said, "No, actually I can't. I just, maybe some of the criteria that you just stated is what I would use, just a sort of an obvious sincerity, genuineness of expression. They're not sort of, parroting concepts, but they're obviously speaking, for real, for
Right.
something they're living.
Yeah.
That was unique for me. I mean, for years I've been reading, the books of spiritual teachers, and you read the book and you try to understand what they're saying,
Right.
and then after, it's sort of like there's a whole reset that takes place, and you read it and you say, okay,
That's what they were saying.
that's what's saying. This is how I would say it, and,
Yeah.
and this is it just became alive.
Yeah.
It's like night and day.
Mm.
The difference between concept and recognition.
Yeah, there's some quote, I can't do it verbatim, but it's from the Buddha. He says, don't believe anything anybody says just because they said it. Even if I say it, Buddha speaking, don't just take it as truth.
Right.
Just go. You have to really go by your own life, by your own experience.
Because depending upon the point of reference that person is speaking, the truth is going to be different.
Right.
If they're speaking, from the point of reference of the absolute, none of this exists.
Right.
It's not there. It's not real.
Mhm.
From the point of view of the relative, the absolute doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's just like if you have a zero, and you have and you multiply it or divide it into anything, that whatever it is, it disappears. Only the zero remains.
Mm.
But if you add something, if you add the zero to anything, the zero disappears.
Mm.
Or so the zero disappears. It's the same integer, but the function changes the reality completely.
Yeah.
And so in the same way, somebody who's in that is like very much identified with who they are as consciousness.
Mhm.
speaks from their truth, and it's just gibberish for somebody hearing it from the point of reference of the relative, and the same and vice versa.
There was a very nice phrase that Maharishi must have repeated a million times, which is that knowledge is different in different states of consciousness, and that you can hear something being said from one state of consciousness, from your own state of consciousness, and you're inevitably going to misinterpret it to some extent. You can't really, but when you rise to the same level of consciousness as the guy who said it, then you can see what he said. And that's just what you're saying. You go back and read these books now that you read 20 years ago and you say, oh, well, that's what they were saying.
Yeah. It's not just misinterpretation either. It's actual literal truth. I mean, from the point of reference of absolute, this doesn't exist. It's like, with Fax Gilbert is a thought. From the point of reference of Fax Gilbert, absolute doesn't exist. And that's real. The awakening is that you're able to hold both as a paradox.
There you go.
And, yeah.
I love it.
Because it is a paradox. I mean, both married together, one totally uninvolved, no qualities, qualityless sap, and the other totally limited, totally full of qualities, married together. And the mind can't hold that. The only place that'll hold that is the heart.
And like Sharon said earlier, you don't want to conflate the two so that you become a qualityless sap.
That's right. That's right.
Let's go through a few of these questions. These are some questions that people emailed to me, and anyone watching this is welcome to email more of them. At the end of this show, there will be titles on the screen, which will include my email address, a chat group where you can participate with people who are interested in this topic, the YouTube channel where all these things are archived, and who knows what else. We'll just keep adding to it. Probably establish a Facebook page after a while. But in any case, these are some questions that people have sent in, and let's just kind of skim through them, and maybe we've already covered some, so we'll skip some. But the first one is, since you awoke or shifted or whatever you want to call it, how has your experience of various human emotions changed? Happiness, fear, compassion, anger, love, whichever one you care to talk about. Are they the same? Are they enhanced? Are they muted? How have they changed?
Well, for me, I would say that there's much more of a dramatic experience of all of the emotions. I think I tamped myself down quite a bit because it would be overwhelming to experience things as fully as I do now. So I do experience, what did you put, anger especially, fear, happiness, passion, I mean all of the above, much more fully. And I don't have, I'm not afraid of experiencing even the great darkness in myself anymore.
I read a book when I was a kid, and there was stuff that you could sprinkle on food called Ever So Much More So. Whatever you sprinkled it on, you get ever so much more so.
Sort of like, what is that, MSG?
Yeah, it's kind of like
Well,
that.
I would just say there's more passion.
Just
the
zest and zeal for
Just
life,
the
kind of
thrill of
thing.
victory and the agony of defeat are more lively. There's
Yeah.
just plunging more into what I like.
Good. Has your diet been affected by this?
It was already bad. It's probably gotten worse. Let's see. I ate less pork than I used to. No,
Not true.
I would say
Pork
no.
producers, it's
No. I would say our diet's probably become more eclectic. I wasn't a vegetarian. I was a vegetarian for a number of years and then stopped. And now I'm not a vegetarian.
Eclectic meaning you just don't worry about it so much.
Right. Yeah.
Well, they say that the Buddha died from eating rancid pork.
really.
He wasn't a vegetarian
Okay.
either.
Wow.
So
I
the
think you
rancid
said
pork.
about the Buddha, that's what I was,
Huh?
you said if there was
Even
something.
if I say it.
Yes, what you
Yeah.
said, that the Buddha apparently had said, don't listen to anyone,
Just don't believe
Yeah.
anything just because somebody said it. Not don't
Right.
listen to anyone.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
take anything as gospel truth because some book says it or because
Yeah.
some person says it or whatever.
Yeah.
check in.
Right, right.
Mm.
Well, that exact sentiment
Mhm.
is actually the moment that really allowed my being to, remember I said there was like a clicking in. And I read it I was reading this book that Samuel Bonder had written, and Samuel Bonder is the one who began this Waking Down work. And right here, I think the last page of his book, he said, so I invite you, something I'm paraphrasing here, but very similar, I invite you to disregard anything that other teachers have said and anything that I have said, which isn't your experience, and to come forward with what your recognition is, who you are, with your truth.
Mm.
And there was something, it just like it invited my being
Mhm.
forward
Yeah.
to inhabit my whole life. It was a really powerful invitation that my being felt. And it was like I'd always been looking to others, and even
Yeah.
reading that book of his, I was, looking for the truth or something in the book that would ring true, and having that invitation from a teacher I respect, saying, no, ignore everything anyone has said, find your truth and be your,
Yeah.
willing to live your truth. That was a really powerful thing for me.
A lot of people who are listening to this will be in the Fairfield community or will have a PM background. And, Marshy once said to a friend of mine who has been meditating since she was a little girl, I think it was way back, 40, 50 years she's been meditating. He once said to her, don't compare yourself with anybody else, because she was doing that. And, I think we've all, at one time or another, had a tendency to read things or hear people talk about flashy experiences that they're having or something and think, God, I'm not having that. I'm kind of a lump of clay compared to that person.
That's right, and that actually, I had that disease of comparing myself unfavorably to everybody else's experience, and at some point, there was, it was like, I was like, oh, they're all having such good experiences, I'm not having that, I'm just such a slug. And then there was a moment when my being said, well, I guess I'm here to be that then, I'm here to be this one. And that saying, whatever this is who I'm here to be. And this is my job, in fact. My job description here is to be this one with these experiences, however unexalted they may be. And it reminded me of that, one of Marshy's favorite verses in the Bhagavad Gita, which is an ancient text, is better is death in one's own dharma, or, station in life.
I have to have that one memorized.
Yeah.
Because one can perform it, one's own dharma, though lesser in merit, is better than the dharma of another. Better is death in one's own dharma, the dharma of another is danger.
Yeah, right. So even someone with a very exalted set of or ways of being in the world, cities or whatever they are, I would rather be who I am, no matter how humble and ordinary.
And the first phrase in that verse is because one can perform it. You can't be somebody
You
else.
can't be someone
You can
else.
only,
Right.
but you're perfect at being who you are.
Absolutely.
Who can do that better?
Nobody.
Let's see. Any change in priorities since your awakening?
Well, we were always drawn to teaching, and so we still are. Just that, the teaching is a little slightly different. It's more from us.
Now you are not only a teacher of spiritual matters, but you do these seminars in high school. Did you
Schools,
feel like
yeah.
in schools of
Yeah.
all kinds, I guess?
Yeah.
Did you feel that your ability to do that, to work as a mime and a presenter of these programs to children, did that change or improve?
I would say it improved in the sense that my ability to connect with the audience, to feel the audience, and to just feel them in my heart is amplified since the awakening.
So Yeah, you kind of tune into them better.
Well, there's more love there. There's more love for who they are and what they're going through and all of that. Whereas before that, there was maybe more of a separation.
Yeah.
And I would connect with them as consciousness, but not as, you know, the woof and woof of being human that I also connect with in myself.
Have you noticed a change in their response to you as a result of this?
Well, my programs are very successful.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Must be fun.
It is. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I feel very fortunate to be able to express myself and have it appreciated and all that. I go from school to school.
Yeah, it's neat to have something you love like that.
It is.
Do you guys, well, I think we kind of covered this, but do you still feel an inclination to sit and meditate, or are you completely engaged in activity when you're awake? What?
I thought that was about, I'm just acknowledging that I understand the question. I don't meditate, and I haven't felt inclined to for many years now, actually. Except that I would say that I don't not meditate ever. I mean, I feel like, you know, I'm awake to what's happening and what's arising all the time. So, but I don't. I just wanted to emphasize that I don't think there's anything wrong with meditation, or I did not discontinue the practice after 30 years lightly.
Right.
But I guess there was a different movement of my being that had to be honored, and that's what's been going on. And I don't. Well, I imagine there's a possibility I could meditate again. So I don't have anything against meditation. I just haven't been inclined to do so about 20 years now.
I meditate occasionally. I sit in front of my eyes. I also, like I'll wake up maybe 4 in the morning and I'll just lie there and allow just be. And so that's a type of meditation, I guess.
Among the people that I know who have awakened, there's a whole gamut. You know? I mean, some people, I'd say that no one tends to be OCD about it like they once might have been, but, you know,
OCD is
obsessive compulsive.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But, you know, some are quite regular with meditation, others don't do it at all, others sort of do it when they feel like it. There's no kind of set.
There's a difference that before meditation was a way to get somewhere else.
Right.
And if you're already, you know, if the boat's on the other side of the river, it doesn't become, it becomes, your relationship to it is different. At least that's my experience.
Yeah.
If I feel something going on inside me, you know, some rumbling, I would say movement within my psyche or in my consciousness, I will sit and just experience it more, tune into it. Yeah. It's kind of but it's not the meditation that I did for all those other years.
But it could easily be defined as meditation.
Yes.
in
Yeah.
Dictionary definition.
Sure.
And somebody told me, well, how long did you meditate? I said, I did practice TM and I enjoyed it for almost 30 years. And he said, well, Mantra's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
He's probably right. He's probably right.
Yeah. Covered most of these. This is one. I mean, you're a professional public speaker and performer, so that's something you're totally comfortable with. You maybe haven't done that sort of thing, but is there any area in your life where you have had to do something that ordinarily would make you nervous, or whatever, where
This would ordinarily.
where you've kind of maybe surprised yourself by being able to do it with aplomb, is the right word.
I didn't want to come to do this. When I heard it was television, it's just something that's a bit foreign to my experience, and I felt nervous about it. But then as soon as I got here and sat with you, I felt completely natural.
Yeah, I had a guy on a couple of weeks ago that used to be so shy that he would kind of calculate in class, where the questions were going to come around to and which one he'd have to answer, and study it so that he would, he was just like terrified of any sort of speaking out or doing anything. And after his awakening, he was invited to speak in front of a group of 12,000 people at the Mega Institute or some such thing. So he was proud, and he said, he just got up there and didn't even feel a ripple. He's speaking to himself.
On the other hand, I feel that you awaken as you are.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily means that you're going to, if you were afraid to public speak before, you're going to be afraid after you're awakened.
Right.
And so if you have, if you're unconscious about certain aspects of your behavior before awakening, you're going to be unconscious about those things after. And so it's like you awaken as you are, and perhaps the capacity for growth and experience is going to gradually, increase because you have more of a foundation. But
Especially if you have
it doesn't
true
necessarily
friends.
convey a change in personality or a change in dharma or any of those things.
But what if you're a wife beater or a thief or a drug addict? Do you awaken as that, or are those things so much an impediment to awakening that chances are you're gonna have to work them out before you awaken?
I don't know.
Because someone's gonna hear this, you awaken as you are, and they're gonna think, I don't want to be what I am. I've got all these flaws. I really suck at this, and I
Well, that's what Sharon was talking
can't get along
about.
with people, and so on and so forth. And so I've got to. I want awakening to improve me. I don't want to just sort of be an enlightened schmuck.
Well, maybe that's a misconception.
Well, I think that what Pax is saying though is like, you do awaken as you are, so whatever crumpled up, version of yourself at that moment. But at the same time, there's always room for and a ability to, improve your character, your disposition, or whatever, if you choose to. And especially if you have true friends who are willing to reflect back to you how your actions impact them.
Yeah.
And so if you're a wife beater and your wife, you can actually hear and see the repercussions of your actions, chances are you'll have a lot more capacity to change your behavior than before.
Good. Well, we could probably go on all night with this, but I think we've covered quite a bit. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we close?
Well, just that I've enjoyed the conversation a lot. One of the questions was, is there any fear about public speaking or whatever? I don't have so much fear about that. I have no problem with large audiences, but when people are asking you about awakening, it's very intimate, and it isn't the easiest thing to talk about. And what I find is that people who are really interested, it's easy to talk about. There's like a receptivity, and it just flows right out, and it's a very spontaneous, creative, organic process that you surprise yourself with what you say.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if somebody I could sense is not really interested, they're just sort of like, very kind of chit-chat or critical or whatever, or then nothing much happens.
Yeah, you can't.
And so I feel that being here, you've made us both feel very comfortable and welcome. I felt that your questions indicated a level of awakening within yourself to be able to ask the questions. You have to have a certain degree of identity formed with that process in order to be able to ask the questions in the first place. And so I want to congratulate you on having the courage to come forward with this show. I think that it's something that will hopefully help a lot of people to, give them the juice to, if there's some process that's being activated to move on it, to move with it. And I just feel gratified in the way that you've treated both of us with respect. And we appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that appreciation.
Yeah.
And it's funny because in putting together a list of people to interview on this show and contacting some of them, there are some who I'm convinced are very profoundly awakened and have been for, in some cases, decades, who are still, I don't know, I want to wouldn't go out in public, you know, I just don't know if I want that label attached to me, you know, and, one of my motivations in doing this show was to kind of remove that stigma and make awakening no more an unusual or thing or something that one would want to keep private any more than one would keep private one's, I don't know, interest in football or, you know, something that we all take for granted. Because it really shouldn't, I mean, it's something that's everyone's birthright, as far as I understand it, and it's something that everyone can benefit from, and, you know, why should one's life be kept under a bushel?
Yeah, and it's,
That's right.
as we said earlier, it's awakening itself is a beginning. It's not an end process. And I think that, you know, the awakenings to come are going to be societal.
Yeah.
They'll be with people who are able to go more fully into who they are and interact with each other in a more profound and true way. And I think that's going to provide the basis for not just individual awakening, but things that we can't even conceive of right now.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect ending, and I won't diminish it by commenting on it. So, thank you all for watching. You'll see in the titles some links to email addresses, website addresses, and so on, which you might want to explore. And if you would like to be put on a mailing list to be notified of future episodes of this show, you'll see that. There's also a YouTube channel you can join and you'll be notified whenever a new video is put up. And if you feel like you might like to be interviewed on the show, if you feel like the nature of your experience is of the sort of thing we've been discussing, then please get in touch with me. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.